Hello, and thank you for joining me on this little video where I will take you through annotating the first section of Wilfred Owen's poem Exposure. Now, I know that annotating a poem doesn't really float your boat, and some of you may feel like it's somewhat boring or irrelevant, but I really, really want you to see that once we start to identify and unpack patterns in poetry, you'll start to see that the poet is really choosing specific language to describe the experience the soldiers were going through, and to really see that that it actually can make a lot of sense, and it can be really quite interesting to see how purposeful the poet has been, where they have a word and a phrase that's put there for a particular meaning and a particular purpose, and it's often designed to evoke a response in us. And if we look closely at the language chosen, we will see those patterns in the use of verbs and adjectives, repeated sounds, and we can even notice how the poet uses the senses. He has recurring themes and images to describe the scene. All of these techniques really help to paint a vivid picture in our minds. And so this is why we spend the time to look closely at poetry, to annotate, to write on our poem, so that we can discover this magic for ourselves.
Okay, so when we annotate a poem, it can be really simple and you don't need to feel overwhelmed or perplexed by this process. I like to break it up into different sections. So the first thing that I like to note when I'm looking at a poem is I like to look at the nouns. I like to look at, a noun is a person, place or thing, so I like to look for those main, the basic words first to get a sense of what's really happening in each stanza. In this particular poem, we are looking at the soldiers, we're looking for words to do with nature and warfare. The next key part of our speech that we look for is verbs. So we often are thinking about, well, what doing words has the poet used? Do they have positive or negative connotations? Are they unusual? Are they interesting? Sometimes verbs can be really powerful. They can be in present or past tense, and how, I guess, active the verb is something I like to look for. I also look out for adjectives, and I like to highlight these. In particular, again, positive or negative connotations to do with how these words are describing the noun. So if you remember, adjectives, their job is to describe the noun. So we are looking to see what adjectives are being used to describe the soldiers or nature or aspects of war. I also look to see if there's anything unusual with the adjectives. Often adjectives are used to create personification and metaphors, and anything interesting, often also emotive, what describing words are being used to capture a particular emotion. Then I like to look at the sensory imagery, and sensory imagery is often created through the nouns, verbs and adjectives. I like to think about what are the visuals, so what am I seeing? What are the sounds? And what things do we feel or touch? Sensory imagery is quite important to a lot of poetry and also any other forms of creative writing, because it is designed to capture the experience. So particularly for Wilfred Owen, he wants to capture vividly the experience of war. He wants to capture the reality of war. And so sensory imagery is designed to make the reader feel like they are there. They want to see, feel and hear exactly what the soldiers are experiencing. So sensory imagery is really, really important. So these are our basic features that I like to look for first. Then we need to unpack and go a bit deeper. So that's when we look for the figurative language. We are referring to things like similes, metaphors and personification. After this, after our figurative language, we then are thinking about, when we find these things, we are looking in terms of what are they capturing about nature and warfare. So often, as we've seen in other Owen poetry, he likes to personify the aspects of warfare. And in this particular poem, we're also looking to see how he's conveying nature. What is he trying to say about nature, and how does he use figurative language to do that? I then like to look for so we've done a lot of, I guess, words to do with what we are seeing and the similes and the metaphors. And then after I've looked at figurative language, I like to then look at the sound devices. Rhyme, sibilance, alliteration, perhaps even onomatopoeia, depending on the poem. But these are the main ones we're going to look at today. And the sound devices are used to create rhythm and regularity to the sound. Often, sound devices are used to also contrast words. They are used to imitate the noises of warfare. And then when we have other, now these are just the other bits and pieces that we might notice and we might find interesting. So ellipsis, I'll explain what that is later if you don't know. I look out for pronouns because they can give me some key information about what the poet is, the perspective of the poet, or what they are suggesting about themselves and other people within the poem. Things like rhetorical questions, or even something like repetition. So there's often the aspects of how the author, the poet, is using punctuation and other aspects of sentences. And then I like to then think about the big ideas. So in this poem in particular, what is Wilfred referring to in terms of nature and death? So I'm looking out for images and words and ideas associated with nature and death. And so what language is used to convey the idea of death or nature? What images stand out to me? So when we are annotating poetry, these are the main things I look for. These are the basics. Anything else that stands out to us and we notice, great, we'll make note of that. But when we're thinking about how the poet has put their poem together, these are the main things, as well as we look at are they using stanzas, how many lines they've used, but these are the ones that I like to pay attention to. Okay, so let's move on. So for this poem exposure, I'm only going to be annotating stanzas 1 to 4. So for the first few, maybe 1 or 2 stanzas, I'm going to show you how I do it. I would like you to copy these annotations down onto your poem. So you can do this in your OneNote, and you can use the draw function, and you can use the same color scheme that I use and do exactly what I do on your own poem. You can also do this in your workbook. If you want to print the poem out, you can do that too. Hit pause anytime you need to just take a break or catch up if I'm going through something a bit too quickly. And at the end of this, when I see you next, I want you to show me your annotations. So there might be times where you want to have a go at annotating without me. So you can pause or skip forward and and just have a go for yourself. So there'll be times when I want you to try it yourself before I show you what I've done. Okay, so let's go into stanza 1. Okay, so let's just revise what happens in stanzas 1 to 4. In stanzas 1 to 4, we see how the soldiers are exposed to harsh natural conditions whilst on the front line in the trenches. Around them are the sights and sounds of war, whilst they themselves wait to be called into action. So I want you to be really looking out for this idea of being exposed to the harsh natural conditions. Okay, so this obviously is something that Owen is wanting to explore and to have a variety of meanings of the word exposed. And the sights and the sounds of war that are happening around them while they wait. So we have this contrast between the nature and war. And in war, we expect that we hear lots of sights and sounds of war, and all of the action we expect to occur from aspects of war. But actually what we see is, funnily enough, most of the action and the threat of death comes not from war, but from nature. Okay, so stanza 1. So we're going to go through that, each one of those annotating aspects that I showed you previously. So first of all, we're going to look at the nouns. So I like to go through and see, and I'm not going to find every single noun. Okay, this is not an exercise in grammar. This is an exercise in trying to get a greater sense of the ideas in each stanza. So I'm going to find the nouns that stand out to me, and to do with the soldiers, to do with nature, and to do with warfare. So these are the ones that I focused on: brains, winds, night, flares, silence, sentries, and the sentries he's just referring to as these are the soldiers, and the idea of nothing. So they're the main ones that stood out to me, and so I like to write down on the side the main nouns, the things, the people, the places that are happening. So we can get a sense, if we make that list, we get a sense that, okay, this stanza is about the wind, soldiers, night, there are flares, reference to memory, there's silence and nothing. So when we concentrate on this, we can see that there's these aspects of nature, and then we've got these aspects of war. And so we can get a sense of the ideas that Owen is exploring. After I've gone through and I've found the nouns, I then like to look at the verbs. So in terms of the positive, negative connotations, anything unusual, anything interesting. So remember, a verb is a doing word. And so what we find is that we have words like ache, knife, wearied, confuse, whisper, curious, nervous. So these are the nouns. And so now we're getting a sense of the action, what is happening here. And we get a sense of some really unusual uses. So this is an unusual verb, and it stands out to us. We also have a collection of verbs here, and that Owen likes to do that. He likes to have a series of 3 words together. You can call that a tricolon, or there's some other words that are the terms that people like to use. And that just gives us, just draws emphasis, emphasizes, I should say, action in particular of the soldiers who are whispering, they're curious and they're nervous. And then we have the adjectives. So Owen repeatedly uses, interestingly, verbs which act as adjectives. So this is where it can get a little bit confusing, because when we look at certain words, we think that they should be verbs, but they're actually being used as adjectives. So when we start to break these up, we get to sense of the pattern. So if we remember that the orange is a noun and the verb is blue, then our adjectives are going to be purple. So their brains ache. Okay, the ache is the doing word. In the merciless iced east winds that knife us. So this part of the sentence, in the merciless iced east winds that knife us, the wind is what Owen is writing about. What is the wind doing? It is knifing them. What is the wind like? It is merciless, it's icy, and it's coming from the east. Okay, so we have the adjective and then we have the verb. So with these descriptions, it's giving us a pretty physical quality, which increases our feelings of horror at the situation. The reader is encouraged to feel and empathize with the suffering of the soldiers as they are exposed to extreme weather conditions, the cold, the wind, and the rain. And by creating this verb, knife, it really makes the wind seem incredibly brutal, aggressive, and threatening. Here are some more adjectives. So the night is silent. The flares are low and drooping, and they confuse them. The soldiers are worried. They are worried by the silence. The sensory imagery. We're looking at sight, sound, and touch. So this opening line, ache, iced, and knife, these words really create this sense of touch, this feeling. They're very, as I said before, a very physical description. We also have sound created through silent, and it's been repeated twice. So we always pay attention when something's been repeated. And we have the whisper, curious, and nervous. Something I want to say about the pattern of the stanzas. You will notice that at the beginning of each stanza, the first line of each stanza, he starts with a very striking first line. And you will get this sense of a pattern where there's a really powerful first line that's often quite physical and quite strong and definite in its description. And then the stanza then builds that image and then ends with that shortest sentence. So if you look at the poem and if you look at the first four stanzas, you will see that he's following a certain pattern. And if you just read the beginning of each stanza, that first line, you'll get a sense of how he is following a pattern for each stanza. They start in a very similar way. Okay, let's move on. So we've done those basic features. Now we're going to look at figurative language. So interestingly, there's a lot of personification used in this poem, and that's really quite powerful. So when we look at personification, we see that he is personifying the wind, and he's saying that the wind lacks no mercy. He is giving the wind the human characteristic of lacking mercy. The wind can't feel, it doesn't have any ulterior motives, but by giving us that impression of the wind being merciless, we now get a sense that the weather is deadly and it's dangerous and it's seeking to harm the soldiers. And that is reinforced with that word that I mentioned before, knife. Okay, that's a very threatening, very aggressive and violent image. So we get a sense now that the wind is violent, it is threatening, it's dangerous, and more importantly, it's hostile. It's like it doesn't want the soldiers to be there. We also have personification created through this word drooping. Before I move on to the sound devices, I just want to make a comment about this idea of drooping, and I want you to see the contrast that he's creating between nature and the warfare. So in this particular context, as the soldiers are in the trenches waiting for action, the action is quite ineffective at this point of the poem, from the warfare perspectives. The flares are drooping, the flares, the lights that they throw up in the sky so they can see over no man's land, they're drooping. So their sense of sight is quite confused. They can't really see what's going on. It's very disorientating, but the threat is not the war. There is no threat from the war because everything's silent. What the threat is nature. Okay, so sound devices. We are looking at rhyme, sibilance, and alliteration. So in terms of rhyme, what's really interesting is that don't know if you've noticed or not, but when we read it, I want you to get a sense of whether or not you think Owen is following a particular rhyme scheme. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Now, do you think that there is a rhyme scheme? Interestingly, we can say that there is a rhyme scheme that Owen is using. And it's through these, what we call the rhyme scheme being A, B, B, A, C. Now, it doesn't sound like it rhymes. That's because Owen is using a para rhyme, and this is what I find really interesting about the way that he's written this poem, is that a para rhyme is the same consonant sounds. So you can see knife, nervous, us, nervous. Okay, these start and end with the same consonant sounds, but the vowel sound, okay, what's in the middle, they are different. So the vowel sounds are not the same. So you can see here, silent, salient, both start and end in the same way, but the vowels are different. Now this is what I think is really cool, is that this is deliberate. It's easy for us to think, oh gosh, he can't even rhyme, doesn't even know, he sucks at this. But we know Wilfred Owen, we know that he can write beautifully, we know he knows how to follow a rhyme scheme. It's just not that he couldn't think of a word to rhyme with knife us. He is doing this deliberately because by not getting that rhyme perfect, he creates this discordant sound. Okay, discordant. Now, discordant just means that it doesn't harmonize very well. There's a wrong note somewhere. And that is because it's reflecting the unease of the soldiers. The soldiers are nervously on edge. And this is the cleverness of this poem, is that Wilfred Owen is trying to demonstrate in a variety of ways this experience. And so by making his rhyme slightly discordant, he is able to capture that nervous energy that the soldiers are feeling. And I think that's just so cool. It's so cool that he's doing all of these different things that we don't even realize when we first read the poem. And then we stop and we investigate and we look for the patterns and we stop and think about what's going on and why is it doing that. And we realize that, that's really cool. I didn't notice that. That's so clever. And then that really gets stuck in your brain. And then you think, well, when I do my own writing, maybe that's something that I can try. Okay, let's move on. So, before I get carried away. Now let's look at some other parts, other features that we can identify. So, what I want to look at is the use of other, okay, the ellipsis and pronouns. So, what you may have noticed is these little dots here, and that's what we call ellipsis. Often ellipsis is used to demonstrate that somebody can't finish their thought, or they're too emotional that they can't finish what they want to say, or their thoughts are broken off because they're confused, or they just don't have the words, either because of their emotional state or a mental state, or they're too shocked, whatever. So here Owen is demonstrating that he, as the speaker of the poem, so not necessarily Wilfred Owen himself, although we do like to biographize these poems, he is demonstrating that the speaker cannot finish these lines, or they just drift off into the silence. Whatever you think works. I think it's a really cool technique because it gives us a sense that there is no ending to this, and it draws on that same idea of this cyclic nature. So also, what we also look for, and one thing that I like to pay attention to in all types of writing, is the use of pronouns, personal pronouns. So here, when I talk about pronouns, I'm talking about me, I, myself, her, she, him, us, we. So here, he doesn't say my brain aches. He doesn't say wearied, I kept awake. He says our brains ache, we, the winds knife us, okay? So he is seeking to, I guess, include himself. Okay, this is him, the speaker of the poem. Sorry, I'm just trying to rub something out and it's not working. There we go. So, he is including himself in this experience. And I think that's a really important thing to note, is that it's not a personal thing for only one soldier. It's also this idea that it's universal. It is happening to all soldiers. And he is experiencing it too. So it also gives him that the authority and the confidence to show what it's really like, because he has experienced it. It's not just him writing a poem back at home. It's actually he's there writing about this right now. Or he has experienced it, so he has the power of that voice, and he is involved. And you'll notice too that there's that repetition in the last line, and you'll know that not every line at the end of each stanza is the same, but we do have this repetition of the phrase nothing happens. And you will see that this line is used to highlight the frustration of the soldiers and how each hour of their torture blends into the next. And I also want you to think about whether or not you think it might be ironic. Is this far from the truth? So I want you to think about that, whether or not you think he's being ironic. Okay, and so as you can see, the last thing that we look out for are the references to nature and death. And the one thing I see here is this reference here, in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. In terms of reference to death, it's just this idea that nature is a threat and that their lives are constantly in danger. All right, let's move on. Stanza 2. All right, so let's have a look at the nouns. I've highlighted these nouns. So these are the nouns that stand out to me. And so it helps me to focus on what is actually being described here. So I get a sense that the wind is being described and the gunfire, and we also know that the soldiers are involved in this stanza. It's easy for us to get distracted by the descriptions and the similes, and we get confused about what's going on. But if we narrow it down, we see that he's referring to the gusts, and then the next line is a continuation of the description of the gusts. And then here we see that he's talking about the gunfire, and then here we're making reference to the soldiers. And so just by doing that, it helps me to really narrow down what exactly is happening and who and what are we supposed to focus on. Verbs. So we have a sense now of the soldiers, again, no action. So they are watching, they are quite passive through that verb. And it's also in the present tense, and I always like to take note of that. And so again, watching, we hear, and again, it's the same thing. It's passive and it's present. They hear. What do they hear? They hear the gusts of the wind, and it's tugging. So see how the wind is more active than the soldiers. And the gunnery is rumbling, so they're hearing those noises. And in terms of the adjectives, so this is where I like to, if I can identify the interesting verbs and then I can compare it to the adjectives, I can get a sense of action. If I can find lots of verbs, then it makes me think that maybe there's lots of action happening. If there's not as much verbs and there's a lot more description, then maybe there's not much action happening. So I want to see whether or not this actually plays out. So we see that we have an adjective mad, the twitching, flickering, dull, some other war. So we have a sense that there's quite a balance between adjectives and verbs. Interestingly, we can see here twitching and flickering are verbs, but they are being used as adjectives. And this is why these verbs, the ing participles, can be used in that way. They've got a bit of an identity, confusion, and so they can play different roles. They can be verbs or they can be adjectives. Also, just these little things here, adverbs, they are details that add to the verb. So we're just getting a little sense of where is the action happening. It's happening northward, and it's incessant, and it's far off. Okay, so by giving us these details, we are understanding where the war is taking place. It's far off, but it's incessant, so it's still there. And so they're waiting, they're watching. But what actually is the main threat? What is the thing that is most pressing? It's the mad gusts that are tugging on the wire. So see, again, we have that contrast between the war and the action of the war, and we have nature and the threat of nature. Okay, so we look at some sensory imagery. What have you found yourself? Hopefully you've noted the word hear, which is a lovely giveaway there. What do they hear? They hear the mad gusts tugging. It has a really nice rhythm to it, mad gusts tugging. And it has a touch sense as well. So often we have senses that combine sound and touch, and so sometimes it's not easy to distinguish the two. We also have some more touch with the twitching agonies. So the pain is almost unbearable. So when they're hearing the wind, now I don't know whether you've been exposed to wind like this, but often on those really windy nights, we live just, we have a valley right behind our house, and our yard is quite exposed, and makes the house grumble, and the windows really rattle. And so it's really quite frightening at some points when you can hear that wind. And so he's giving us this really cool image of how awful it is to hear the wind because of the way he describes it. It's this idea of it being, it's using that reference to agony. So the wind going through the wire, tugging on them. See how physical that is? It's tugging on the wire. It sounds like the twitching agonies of men. It sounds like men dying among its brambles. So we have this echo of past fighting coming into the way he describes what he's experiencing. So here we can, through that sensory imagery, we can respond emotionally with distress, distaste, anger, etc. The rumble of distant gunfire does increase the tension, even though it's far off. We have the impression of it drawing closer. Okay, so here we have this sense of tension, that it is going to come at some point. And in some way, here, what are we doing here? This breaks that tension a little. Yeah, it's a really interesting technique. So the sensory imagery really creates this vivid experience that the soldiers are going through. And the sound also adds to that. The flickering gunnery rumbles. A bit of onomatopoeia there. See if I can. I always forget how to spell it. I don't know if that's right. Anyway, there's quite a lot of O's in onomatopoeia. So it's rumbling. So when we now look at the figurative language, we can get another layer on these images. So the choice of the adjective mad gives the wind a human characteristic, which is personification. And this creates a vivid image which really unsettles the reader. Mad gusts, and I can really imagine that, and I can feel that, because it gives this idea of that it's so unpredictable. And the soldiers are vulnerable. So the mad gusts are tugging on the wire, and then he extends the image. So we just have that single image of the wind tugging on the wire. But he makes it a little bit more interesting by adding the word mad, and then he makes it even more interesting by adding the simile. So what is the gusts of wind like? They are like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. So it's not just the sound of the wind that this simile is seeking to develop, but it's also the feeling, twitching agonies. Okay, really quite vivid. And also this gunnery rumbles. So again, He could just write northward incessantly gunnery rumbles, okay? But he adds flickering gunnery rumbles. So that adjective adds to the image, and then he builds the image more. He develops the image more, like a dull rumor of some other war. It seems so far off that it actually feels like it's just a, I don't know, like a mirage. And this is the idea also, drawing on this idea of the confusion that he referred to, the speaker refers to previously. And again, it's this idea that the soldiers have been doing this day in, day out. They're tired, they're probably mentally and emotionally exhausted. And so things don't always feel like they're really actually happening. And because they've been waiting so long for action to occur, it now just feels like it's not, it's just something that's happened, or it's a rumor, so it might happen. It might come, but they don't know. And then we have the sound devices. You can see again the power rhyme. This is all the way through the poem. And what else do we see? The pronouns again. And then we have the rhetorical question, what are we doing here? It's an interesting phrasing and it's an interesting technique. He could have, Owen could have written, they didn't know what they were doing here, but he keeps it in this second person inclusive, what are we doing here? Almost like he's speaking to the other soldiers. And it also creates this really strong personal voice. References to nature and death, the twitching agonies of men. So as I said before, these images of death sort of infiltrate his descriptions. So it gives us this sense that we are not far away. The people, the soldiers in this story are not far away from death. Okay, stanza 3. So before you go on with this video, you might want to stop, you might want to hit pause and see what you can find yourself in terms of nouns, verbs, adjectives, sensory imagery. See what you can find out for yourself before you see what I find. Okay, so let's see what you were able to find out. So we've got the nouns here. The misery of dawn, war, rain, clouds, dawn, army, ranks of grey. So when we write them down, I wonder if you did this, and I really recommend that you do try and do this. Copy these things down. Dawn, soldiers, war, rain, clouds, grey. Gives us a really miserable impression. And so you can see by pulling out these words, writing them down, we're getting a greater sense of what the poet is seeking to do. Verbs: grow, lasts, soaks, sag, massing, attacks. So when you see the verbs, you see that actually the really active verbs, massing and attack, comes from the dawn, not from the war. War lasts. It's there, always. Dawn is beginning to grow. And it's this sense that, oh, here we go. And it's really quite miserable and quite depressing. The verbs, make a note, write down that the active aggressive verbs come from nature, not from the war. And you can see here the punchy combination of 3 present tense verbs gives a sense of immediacy. War lasts, soaks, sag. Okay, again, the use of 3s, that tricolon, gives us a sense of immediacy. It's happening right here, right now, because the verbs are in the present tense. you know, you think about how it would sound if he wrote this in the past tense. It wouldn't be as powerful. Okay. Let's move on to, we have some adverbs here that is give us more information. The clouds sag, but they're stormy, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The attack, they attack in ranks. Sensory imagery. The rain soaks, this is again that touch sense. The sight and touch of clouds sag, stormy. And it also creates this colour imagery. So this colour imagery is created through these adjectives, the idea of stormy, the dawn, creates this, so everything is grey and miserable. So you can see with some of these descriptions, the colour choices are really quite purposeful. He is creating a bleak and miserable scene with his colour palette, blacks, whites and greys. So basically, the effect of the colour imagery is that it's bleak and let's go, I've already written miserable, let's go with hopeless. Bleak and hopeless. And some more sensory imagery as well. Okay, so the figurative language. What we can see, and what I'm sure you've noticed, is the references to dawn. Dawn, massing in the east, her melancholy army attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. So we can see that dawn has been personified, and we can see that she has been given an army, which makes her, again, threatening and violent. And dawn is attacking again, and we have the army, dawn's army that's attacking is in ranks. So they are being attacked by nature. Interestingly, what are they attacking? What is dawn attacking? They are attacking the shivering ranks of grey. So when we stop and look at this, we realise that the shivering ranks of grey are the soldiers. So it seems like dawn's melancholy army, it's an interesting word choice, melancholy. You can see that's also personification. The melancholy army is mirroring the mood and the physical sensations of the soldiers. Sound devices, again, the para rhyme. We have sibilance, which is the repetition of the S sound. So lasts, soaks, clouds, sags, stormy. And often sibilance is used to really capture a specific sound and rhythm. And often you notice that the sound of that S is really quite, it's a long sound. It's really hard for us to make it a quick sound. And it can also be a quiet sound. So potentially we have Wilfred Owen creating the sound of the place, the sound of the silence, of the nothing that is happening. And then you can see the repetition of death. This is a repetition of the phrase nothing happens. So you have the build-up of this scene of Dawn collecting her army, and then you have the anticlimax of nothing happens. One thing I want to say about Dawn, usually Dawn is a symbol of hope. There's a sense of a future, of a new day. So there's lots of positive symbolic references to dawn. But in this poem, it is not a symbol of hope. It's not a symbol of there's going to be, a promising new day. It's not a symbol of something beginning, okay? This is the opposite. And it's interesting because so often he subverts usual expected images. So when we talk about subvert, we're talking about how it's flipped upside down. He is flipping upside down the usual image of dawn to demonstrate that the usual does not occur here. And what we normally expect to happen in lives back at home don't take place here. This is the effect of war. References to death. We can see here that this metaphor with dawn is a fairly complex metaphor. So rain is figured as the attacking army, an image that is laid over the physical experience of the soldiers whom the rain is drenching. Okay, last stanza. The nouns, we have the flights of bullets, silence again, air, snow, flakes, and the wind. So here we can get a sense of what is happening in this stanza, and we have more references to nature and the weather than we do to the fighting. The verbs streak, shudders, flock, pause, and renew. The word flock here is essentially referring to the idea of moving and going together in a crowd. So that he's talking about the flakes and how the flakes flock and then they pause and then they renew. Maybe they grow up, they turn into more flakes, or they move off again, or that's watching the movement of the flakes. And there's a strange beauty in that series of 3 verbs there. And again, that idea of the passive, they're just watching, they're not actually doing anything. They're watching them wander up and down. And the adjectives. We have the flights of bullets that are being described as sudden and successive, but they're less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. Some of these here, potentially, these descriptions I've put as adjectives, but they could easily also be considered adverbial phrases. Sidelong flowing flakes. Now the air is described as being black with snow and having sidelong flowing flakes. Okay, so this is the air, the wind is moving the flakes, and it's interesting to show that that the air is referred to as black with snow. And again, this is another example of Owen subverting. He's subverting conventional ideas of snow as being pure. And this is making us feel very unsettled. So it's the effect is that he is creating a unsettling and sinister atmosphere. Also, this word nonchalant, if you don't know what that word means, basically it means feeling or appearing casual and calm and relaxed. You're not worried about anything. So the wind is being referred to as being really calm and relaxed, which is interesting because that's exactly what the soldiers are not feeling. The sensory imagery. Flights of bullets streak the silence is some sound. We have some sight and touch here, and we have some more sight. One thing that I want to note is this use of sound in this first line. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. So we can see that the silence is interrupted by the harsher sound of machine gun fire, and this increases the sense of danger. So all this action that we've been waiting for is interrupted at this point. But interestingly, he demonstrates to us that it's actually less deadly than the air. So we think we're about to have some action with that sound of sudden successive flights, but then it ends up, he draws our attention to the air again. So we're drawn back to nature. Okay, so let's look at some figurative language. The shudders gives human characteristics to the snow, which again mirrors the fear of the soldiers. And we have personification with that word, nonchalance. The sibilance is created here in the opening line to imitate the sound of the bullets. And this is the noise that they are hearing, and Owen reinforces that through his sibilance. And we have some alliteration as well. Often alliteration is drawing our attention to particular words and also to create the flow and the movement of the action. We notice again the repetition of this last line, nothing happens. And again, we can see that it's just highlighting the soldier's frustration. References to death. So the snow is no less deadly than the bullets that streak overhead. They mingle in the mind of the narrator, suggesting that death could come at the hands of man or nature, as the soldiers are exposed to both. So we can see that nature is hostile and just as likely to kill the soldiers as the bullets are. Okay, so you might want to write that down. Nature, hostile, and deadly. Okay, so that is it for the first 4 stanzas of this poem. See if you can find anything else that I didn't point out today. Go back through your annotations and make any changes that you need to. And so you can show me how you went. So hopefully going through that process of looking at the nouns, the verbs, the adjectives, the sensory imagery, figurative language and sound devices and anything else, hopefully that has helped you to have greater confidence in finding the patterns and finding interesting language choices that Owen has made. Yeah, so I really hope that that's helped you, and I look forward to seeing your annotations. Until then, have a great day.